Package is not playing. Zookeeper Mark attempted to clarify that it's only a few minutes, sir, and I'm not ignoring my responsibilities that. Dog, he's going hungry, and I don't give a damn about you. I called well snapped again, and you're gone. Mark felt the sting of his boss's remarks, but he couldn't bring himself to desert his friend that night, so he chose to take the chance as. When he gave a friend another sandwich, a neighbor took a photo and posted it online with the caption, "This man feeds a stray." Compassion isn't dead. The message swiftly garnered popularity, but Mark had no idea why he was taking his puppy every night on his delivery route. Mark went about his business as usual the next day, oblivious to the tempest it would unleash. As he placed items into his truck, a modest act of generosity had already started to ripple far beyond the quiet alley. Observed his coworkers chatting and looking at him, but he dismissed it, concentrating on his route and determined to finish. On schedule and true to his word to Buddy, Mark returned to the alley with his sandwich in hand by the time nighttime came. As Mark knelt down to pet him, he was met with a wagging tail, a far cry from the wary dog he had first seen. Mark turned to see a young woman when he heard a strange voice behind him. "You're the delivery guy from that photo, right?" She showed him the viral post that had been shared hundreds of times while clutching her phone, her eyes full of excitement and wonder, frequently with headlines such as, "Everyday Hero Spotted," and "This is what." Mark's cheeks appeared to be heated. "I didn't do it for attention," he said. "Simply couldn't let him go hungry." And the woman's lovely smile caught everyone's attention. "Keep it up," Mark said with a kind nod, unsure of how to react as the woman left. He looked at his friend stroking behind the dog's ears and joked, "Looks like you're famous now." But he was secretly concerned. This kind of attention may make matters more difficult, particularly if Quell discovered that Mark merely showed up for work the following morning. Cowell sat behind his desk, his face averted, to be called into the manager's office. A printout of the viral post was on the desk. Thus, this is a storm cloud of rage. "It takes 2 minutes, sir. What have you been doing during my time?" Coldwell spat, pointing to the picture. Mark refused to back down. Cowell slapped his fist on the desk and said, "Mark, you're fired. Pack your things. It has no bearing on my deliveries." The remark struck Mark like a kick to the stomach for giving food to a stray dog. "You're really letting me go for this?" he asked, his voice shaking as his chest constricted with rage and incredulity. Coldwell remarked icily, "Rules are rules." And then he left, beaten. Mark gave him back his attire and departed the workplace with a heavy heart, unsure about how he would maintain his apartment as his only source of income or pay his debts. Knowing that he hadn't deserted his friend that night gave him comfort. Mark visited his friend as normal, despite the fact that he no longer brought the last of his savings in dog food and sat next to the stray, sharing the silence, for he had a job to drive to. Friendship that had been so significant to him as he sat there. And to Mark's astonishment, a car drew up. The woman from the night before came out with a small camera crew in tow. "Mark Wright," she said, grinning pleasantly. "I'm Emily, and I would love to feature your story on my local news blog." Mark, "I'm not sure if that's a smart idea, and I just lost my job as a result." Emily's face softened even more, which is why it's important for people to know that occasionally doing the right thing is okay. "Comes at a price." Mark groaned, looking at his friend, who nodded in agreement after a little pause. "Let's do it." Emily's interview, which was shown that evening, demonstrated Mark's relationship with Buddy and his readiness to jeopardize his career for. An act of generosity caused the tale to quickly go viral and flood social media. Donations poured in after Mark received supportive notes, and people offered him anything from job leads to groceries. However, the most unexpected thing happened the next day when Mark was looking through his phone and discovered a message from a local. They offered to help friend by finding him a home and providing him with medical care at the animal shelter, but then there was. Mark was shocked to learn that Coldwell's name was trending online and that people were furious that he had been involved in the dismissal. By the end of the day, Mark and his company were being bombarded with negative reviews and irate remarks. Although Mark wasn't sure he wanted it, Coldwell's firm offered him his job back and apologized in public. Mark's tale kept gaining traction, reaching people beyond of his little town thanks to donations from kind strangers. Were plenty to purchase healthy food for Buddy and pay for his checkup. And aside from that, the dog was healthier than Mark had anticipated. Despite being undernourished, he displayed no symptoms of a dangerous illness, and the veterinarian even praised his kind disposition, saying Mark felt incredibly fortunate to have found you, but his happiness was tempered with doubt because he still hadn't. Despite the overwhelming support on the internet, he made the decision to return to his previous position following Coldwell's pathetic apologies. The following day, Mark's hatred toward his old boss persisted. Receive a surprise phone call from Emily, the blogger who had conducted the interview. Her voice was full of, "I just had a call from someone who saw your article, Mark," and he was really excited. He furrowed his brow and asked. Emily inquired if you were familiar with the Peterson Foundation, one of the biggest animal rescue groups. Mark's heart skipped a beat when the director of the Peterson Foundation in the country noticed your tale and wanted to meet you. Was renowned throughout the world for their efforts to rescue and rehome animals. He had seen their work featured in documentaries and hoped to be involved in something similar. But are you certain why they would want to meet him? Mark nervously said, "They've got the right person," and Emily chuckled. "Trust me, I'm aware of who you are, and I have scheduled a meeting for you in their local office for tomorrow morning, Mark." Uncertain of what to anticipate, I arrived at the Peterson Foundation office. The welcome room was crowded with phones ringing, activity volunteers setting up supplies, and the slight sound of barking from the outback kennels. A happy woman greeted him. "You must be Mark," she said, holding out her hand. Mark, the director of the foundation, shook Anna Peterson's hand, still feeling a little uncomfortable. "But it's good to meet. I'm not sure why I'm here, but you represent all we stand for," which is why Anna smiled warmly. "Your story touched us, and we would like to share your compassion, generosity, and conviction that every animal deserves a chance." Mark squinted in shock as he saw you working at the foundation. Anna clarified that we would like you to join our outreach team, where you would assist us in establishing connections with communities and spreading awareness about stray animals and planned rescue operations. So naturally, we'd also want to have Buddy join our team as an ambassador. Mark looked at his friend, who was joyfully wagging his tail next to him. And a smile grew as Mark stammered, "This is amazing, but I don't have any formal experience. Compassion like yours may be learned, so why don't we trust in you, Mark?" When Mark left the meeting, his thoughts were racing because the offer was more than simply a job. It was an opportunity to turning his love of assisting animals into a profession. But it also meant entering a very different world, one that came with its own difficulties and doubts. But Mark couldn't help but gallop joyfully with his friend as he made his way back to his car. However, consider how far they had gone since they first met in the alley, where he fed the stray dog out of pure. Mark spent the remainder of the day thinking about how compassion had not only transformed his life, but also opened opportunities he never thought were available. As he considered Anna Peterson's offer, he had both thrill and a sense of responsibility. Could he truly move into a position at the Peterson Foundation and create such a significant impact? His life had always been straightforward. This new chance felt like a leap into the unknown at home because it revolved around work and simple routines. On the kitchen table, spread out the documents Anna had given him, with the job description in bold characters. Mark grinned as he looked down at his friend, who was lying at his feet with his tail thumping idly against the ground. "What do you think?" he said. "I think I have what it takes," while scratching behind the dog's ears. Buddy yawned, but Mark, the dog's laid-back attitude, gave him a sense of validation. So he took out his phone and contacted Emily to let her know that I had been offered a position. He seemed shocked, but I knew they would. Eagerly responded, "Mark, are you going to take advantage of this opportunity? It's exactly what you deserve. I'm not sure if it's a significant difference, and I'm afraid I might ruin Emily's tone. Dear Mark, you've already shown that you have the heart to do this. Aside from that, you can learn the rest. Consider how many." Even though Emily couldn't see him, Mark nodded. "You're right, I'll sleep." Animals you could help aren't worth the risk. On it, but I believe I know what I need to do. Mark called Anna the following morning to accept the offer, and her reply was, "Quick and excited, Mark. That's fantastic news. We're so happy you've joined the team. Let's arrange your." After hanging up, Mark experienced a mixture of apprehension and exhilaration as the decision was made. Yet he had to overcome the last obstacle of telling Caldwell that he was aware that his former employer had only apologized due to the dread. Mark was triggered by the criticism and the idea of justifying his departure. Made the decision to end it and went to the delivery center, where Caldwell was in his office going through documents. Mark Caldwell's tone was reserved when he knocked on the door. "Takes you here. I wanted to inform you that I will not be returning," Mark stated forcefully. "I've agreed to work for the Peterson Foundation." Caldwell's brows tightened. "You're really an animal." Considering that Mark corrected his posture, he's going to lose his steady employment. Additionally, it's an opportunity to take significant action to support animals like my friend that have no one else to turn to. "Thank you for the chance, but this is what I intended to do." Caldwell snorted suit. "So please don't. Everyone has another shot, so don't back down if things don't work out." Mark stood his ground, "So I won't have to, but thank you for the warning." For the first time in years, Mark had a sense of closure as he left the office, was embracing uncertainty and moving away from stability, but it felt right. The following week was jam-packed with events. Mark went to training sessions at the foundation to learn about animals, the difficulties of planning rescue operations, and providing care to the community. Swiftly become a favorite of the staff because of his wagging tail and amiable manner, which made everyone smile wherever he went. Mark's confidence increased. As time went on, he started to perceive himself as someone who could actually contribute rather than as an outsider. His first official assignment in relation to the foundation's objective was to help with a local adoption event where he and Buddy would. On the day of the event, Mark was there to welcome guests and tell them about the animals up for adoption. Families and animal enthusiasts poured into the area as they browsed the adoption kiosks at the Park Buddy's entrance. While engaging in conversation with volunteers, Mark's friend was an innate ambassador who captivated people with his kind demeanor. Felt a surge of satisfaction when he saw a young girl bend to pet his friend, her eyes brightening as she inquired about his background. As Stray Mark stated, "Friend used to be, but now he's a member of a family, and today." The girl's mother grinned and said, "Thank you for what you're doing. We hope to help other animals find their forever homes too." Seeing someone make such a difference is encouraging. As the day progressed, Mark came to the realization that he had discovered his. Numerous animals were adopted and innumerable funds were raised, making the event a huge success. As Mark packed up the things, Buddy was at the center of it all, their relationship proving the strength of compassion. At the end of the day, Anna came up to him and said, "Mark, you did a fantastic job today." Mark grinned and said, "It's easy when you believe in what you're doing." Anna nodded the child. "Insightful statement. I believe that this is only the beginning for you, Mark. You and Buddy will do amazing things." With increasing self-assurance, he adapted to his new position at the Peterson Foundation and became the unofficial mascot of their endeavors, adding warmth and happiness to every occasion. The tale of resilience and second chances struck a profound chord, garnering media and local community attention. But as rewarding as his new position was, it also presented difficulties that Mark hadn't expected the Foundation's goal to. Animal rescue and rehoming wasn't all about inspiring tales of triumph. It frequently required overcoming tragic facts. When Mark arrived at the shelter one cold morning, Anna was there to greet him with a, "Mark, I'm worried about this." She mentioned that a nearby warehouse has been abandoned, and we've gotten. The neighbors claim they have been hearing work for days, and there have been tales of multiple stray dogs stuck within Mark's stomach. Tightened. "We don't yet know how many dogs we're referring to." Anna shrugged. "We have authorization from the city to enter the land, but we must move quickly because of the weather and the conditions." Sensing the urgency, the rough Buddy inside probably barked gently and waggled his tail, signaling that we've got this. A rescue squad comprising Mark's friend and other seasoned volunteers showed up at. Later that morning, the warehouse was in a condition of disrepair, with the walls and windows boarded up, covered in graffiti, and from inside came a quiet yet clear barking chorus. The notion of the scared animals inside Lun makes Mark's heart hurt. He spoke steadily but resolutely, and the group divided into pairs, each with a lantern, leash, and crates. The floor was covered in garbage, and the air was musty and moist. Mark and Buddy led. The first dog, a tiny terrier mix, was tucked in a corner when they arrived, guided by the sound of whining. Mark squatted down and spoke softly, quivering with anxiety. The terrier's ears perked up as the friend slowly approached. During Buddy's presence, and following a few nervous moments, she let Mark put a leash around her neck one by one. Discovered that the majority of the other dogs were undernourished and wary, their faith in people obviously damaged. Friend played a vital part, serving as a soothing influence that reduced their anxiety by the time the procedure was over. Rescued a total of 7 dogs, each of whom served as a devastating reminder of the terrible conditions that some animals must endure back at the. Mark stayed late to assist with feeding and bathing the rescued canines, as the shelter staff worked nonstop to care for them. Was unable to ignore a certain dog, a big, brindled mastiff with soulful eyes, who would not eat or engage with anyone. "You're okay now," Buddy Mark whispered softly as he kneeled beside the mastiff's crate. Mark was aware that the dog was safe as it gazed back at him with a distrustful expression. Would require some time to establish a relationship, and as the days stretched into weeks, the mastiff, whom Mark called Titan, continued to be withdrawn. As the other dogs started to get better and exhibit signs of trust, Titan appeared to be trapped in his dread, so Mark made it his personal objective to assist Titan heal by spending more time sitting close to his box and using calming voices. Titan finally took a cautious stride toward Mark that evening after weeks of painstaking effort. It was a minor win, but one that gave Mark hope. The staff at the shelter put in a lot of effort to care for the rescued dogs, and Mark stayed there. He was running late trying to feed and bathe them when he noticed a big, brindled mastiff with sincere eyes that wouldn't eat or talk to anyone hello. Friend Mark whispered softly while kneeling beside the mastiff's kennel. The dog returned his stare. "It's okay. You're safe now." Mark groaned, heavy with skepticism, knowing that bonding would take time. As the days stretched into weeks, Mark's mastiff, Titan, continued to be withdrawn. As the other dogs started to get better and exhibit signs of trust, Titan appeared to be trapped in his dread, so Mark made it his personal objective to assist Titan heal by spending more time sitting close to his box and using calming voices. Titan finally took a cautious stride toward Mark that evening after weeks of painstaking effort. It was a minor win, but one that gave Mark optimism since he'd seen how much work was involved as the shelter flourished under its newfound focus. Making a difference during a play session with Titan, he gradually started to open up and wag his tail for the first time. The transformations of Buddy and the other rescued pets in happy homes are evidence of the strength of compassion, and eventually, Mark's path was far from finished, but he experienced a renewed sense of purpose despite the difficulties he faced alone. Reinforced his determination by serving as a reminder of Mark's commitment to the shelter and the reason he had chosen this route in the first place. Became a defining characteristic of his life, bringing with it new difficulties and victories every day. But as the work expanded, so did the emotional burden. Despite assigning certain tasks, Mark was faced with challenges that put his determination on a soggy evening. Mark got a call from Clara, a woman who had. Clara wanted to give up her 7-year-old golden retriever puppy, Max, after learning about the shelter's efforts. Her voice faltered as she described her predicament. "I love Max, but I can't care for him because of my deteriorating health," she said. "He's my best friend. I don't want him to feel abandoned, but I have no choice." With a deep sense of remorse, Clara was Mark's first option. and he promised her that they would take Max in and find him a loving home the next day. When Clara arrived at the shelter, her face was marked with sadness. Her hands were shaking as she gripped Max's collar, knelt to give him a final hug, saying, "I'm so sorry, boy," with tears running down her cheeks. One day, Mark came up to her gently and took a look down her face. "I think you'll understand. I swear to take good care of him, Clara." She nodded and wiped away her tears. "Thank you. He's a—" Mark felt a knot in his throat as she walked away. "What a great dog. He deserves a good life." He looked at Maxon, who was sitting at the door, and his gaze was focused on the location where Clara had vanished. The dog gave a quiet. Mark, his tail drooping, squatted down to Max's level and said, "Hey buddy, I know. It's difficult, but we'll see to it that you're all right over the coming days." Max was so depressed that he seldom ate, and Mark did everything he could to cheer him up, but he spent much of his time sleeping in his kennel with his head resting on his paws. Lengthy walks, special treats, and even meeting a friend, but one afternoon, nothing seemed to help. Mark heard 2 volunteers talking about Max while cleaning the kennels. "Poor man," one of them remarked that it seemed like he had given up, and Mark hesitated, their comments striking him forcefully. He sat in Max's kennel that night, since he couldn't bear the idea of Max feeling so hopeless, and spoke to him in a. Mark remarked in a calming manner, "I know you miss her, and that it's acceptable to be depressed, but she did." Max's ears perked up at Mark's voice because she loves you and wants you to have a better life. He raised his head a little. It was a modest reaction, but it offered Mark hope as the shelter dealt with another problem. A nearby developer has declared plans to construct a commercial center close to the shelter rising. Anna convened an urgent meeting to address her worries about noise and pollution in order to explore the possible consequences and methods too. Anna stated in a firm tone that we must take action because this development could have a major impact on our creatures. Mark offered to spearhead the initiative, organizing a community rally to support the refuge. Petition drive, frequently accompanied by a friend, spoke at town hall meetings, and even used social media to raise awareness. As a charming mascot for their cause, he drew out the best in them by opposing the development. Worse than people, but although many supported the refuge, others wrote off their worries as exaggerated. Mark experienced animosity during a meeting where a development representative laughed at their points. It's not like running a hospital, but an animal shelter," the man stated dismissively. When it came to these animals, Mark's rage flashed, but he maintained his control. "They can't speak for themselves, so we must, and we won't stop until it's a question of life and death," he said. As the weeks went by, Mark's perseverance paid off, and the community's support increased with local. The shelter's social media posts gained widespread notice, attracting companies and residents to support their cause. Despite her deteriorating health, national groups even submitted a passionate letter to the local council on Clara's behalf. Max started to show signs of improvement during this period, eating more and pleading with them to safeguard the refuge. Friend was crucial in encouraging Max to do this because he would frequently and even wag his tail when Mark gave him his favorite toy, participate in his playing, and provide peaceful company at trying times. One evening, Mark sat in the. Max approached the shelter's office to see the findings of their petition and laid his head on Mark's lap. It was a straightforward gesture, but it made Mark cry. "You're going to be okay," Mark reassured him, caressing his fur. "We're all going to be all right." The shelter's endeavors reached a public hearing where Mark gave an impassioned speech regarding the value of their labor. He told tales of creatures like Max and Buddy. The hearing concluded with a unanimous judgment to enforce the transformational power of compassion, limitations on the construction to guarantee the shelter security. The triumph was greeted with applause and embraces, but seeing Max wag his tail enthusiastically for the first time since coming to the shelter was the biggest reward. Mark learned a lot from his time at the shelter, but the most important lesson was how resilient the animals, and despite the difficulties and emotional toll, he knew he was in the right place and had won the battle. Donations from supporters flooded in after the projected construction offered the shelter a much-needed boost in morale. Had kept up with their narrative on the internet, and fresh volunteers volunteered to assist for a while. Although it appeared that everything was finally falling into a rhythm of positivity, life at the shelter had a way of tossing curveballs, and Mark was going to take on a new challenge that he had never anticipated. It began when a man called. Roger, who claimed to be Buddy's owner, had a voice that was virtually like Kurt's. I saw a photo of the dog on your social media, and he was accusing as he talked about a golden retriever he had lost months prior. Mark was shocked when Roger remarked, "That's my dog, and I want him back." His friend had been discovered as a stray with no indications of ownership, no collar, microchip, or reports. The notion that it was like a kick to the belly to hear that someone might eventually claim him. "I'll need proof of ownership," Mark stated firmly, trying to hide his discomfort. "But we want to make sure he's in Roger's capable hands after months of him being with us." Complained, but consented to visit the shelter with proof. As Mark hung up, a feeling of dread began to creep in. It was intolerable to lose a friend who had grown to be the shelter's lifeblood. Roger showed up He was a tall, wiry man with a piercing stare who had a frown on his face. That immediately raised Mark's suspicions. He was holding a stack of documents and an old golden retriever photo. That looked a lot like his friend. "This is him," Roger added, indicating the picture of him that vanished during a storm. "Pulled down our fence, and ever since Mark looked at the picture, I've been trying to find him. Appear to be friends, but something about Roger's behavior bothered him." Friend had prospered in the shelter, displaying feelings of happiness and love that appeared to be in contrast to the tension emanating from Roger. Does a friend react? Mark inquired about his previous name, attempting to get further information from Roger, who hesitated. I called him Max Mark, who slowly nodded as I noticed that a friend who was relaxing close had not responded to my call. Here, Mark phoned to test a claimed friend, but instead of moving, he wagged his tail. Roger reacted languidly when he heard Mark's voice. Perhaps he's simply not used to it. It's been a while since Mark made that decision. "We need to confirm these documents and check with local records to stall for time," he stated in a calm tone. Roger's jaw tensed, but he nodded okay. "If everything checks up, we'll talk about what to do next. Just don't take too long." Anna Ever, the voice of reason, advised running after Mark assembled his staff to address the situation following Roger's departure. Buddy's picture via lost pet databases to verify Roger's assertions in the interim. Volunteers expressed Mark's concern about bringing a friend back to someone who didn't seem to care. What if he wasn't? Buddy is really happy here, but it doesn't make sense for a good owner to ask a volunteer. Mark agreed that he should have fled unless something was amiss, but he understood that they needed to handle the situation properly if, no matter how uncomfortable Roger's days were, they couldn't deny him his dog since his claim was valid. To a week as Mark waited for the database search's findings. Roger became increasingly demanding and frequent in his calls, accusing Mark of being slow and threatening to sue if. When Buddy wasn't returned, Mark confided in Anna, who expressed his worries. "Doesn't add up," she remarked. "If he truly loved Buddy, why would he wait so long to look for shelters?" Buddy reacting to him. The matter escalated when Roger unexpectedly arrived, and his annoyance boiled over. Sensing the tension, his friend barked, "I'm not leaving without my dog." His voice reverberated throughout the shelter. "Roger, I know you're unhappy," Mark remarked calmly as he came forward to defuse the situation. "However, we have procedures to adhere to. If your claim is valid, we'll settle this appropriately." Roger scowled at Mark while clenching his fists. Before leaving that evening, Mark, he growled, "You better hope I don't find out you're lying about this." He decided to look further by contacting contacts since he couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was gravely wrong. A woman named Linda contacted him back with shocking information about Roger's past at a local shelter and rescue. He had already been reported for neglect, and one of his pets ended up in our care, Linda remarked gravely. Mark's blood raced cold when he realized he wasn't properly caring for it, so he promptly recorded the details, and ready to take the situation to the next level. If Roger's history of neglect was real, there was no choice but to return to him. Mark spoke with a local animal welfare attorney the following morning, outlining the circumstances and providing Linda's report. The lawyer told Mark that, with the proof of Roger's negligence and Buddy's seeming lack of. Upon realizing that Mark had hung up, his friend trotted over and nuzzled his leg. Seeing that he was uncomfortable, Mark knelt down and gave the dog a strong hug. Mark felt conflicted as the legal proceedings progressed, but he whispered, "I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe," of resolve and trepidation. But the attorney reassured him that they had a solid case because of Roger's tenacity and ferocity. Made the situation tense since Mark understood that the struggle was for all stray animals, not just Buddy. Staff at the shelter came together to support Marin and Anna because they felt that the abandoned puppy deserved better than people like Roger. Launching a public awareness campaign and sharing Buddy's story on social media to garner support. The response was amazing, emphasizing his journey from a shy stray to a cherished member of the shelter. Supporters flooded in with comments telling them to keep their friend safe at all costs because he is better off with you. The campaign attracted the attention of a supporter who said, "Don't let him go back to someone who doesn't truly care for him." Mark was initially concerned about upsetting the local news station that requested an interview, but Anna persuaded him that this wasn't only about Buddy Anna, and that it was a chance to raise awareness of the suffering of abandoned animals. Stated that during the interview, Mark, "It's important to demonstrate to people the consequences of failing to defend these dogs." Discussed Buddy's transformation from a terrified stray to the shelter's mascot, and he spoke fervently about the significance of good pet ownership and the necessity of holding negligent individuals accountable, as the broadcast revealed. Even others who had never made a donation to the cause sent Mark encouraging comments that evening. Shelter before contacting them to ask about volunteering Roger or to provide financial assistance, but was less than happy. He rushed into the shelter the following day, his face flushed with rage. Mark defended himself by accusing me of being the villain and yelling, which is defamatory. "We never revealed your name, Roger, and we were only speaking out for Buddy's welfare. If you have nothing to conceal, nothing to be concerned about." Roger scowled at Mark without answering, instead turning and rushed out, slamming the door behind him. As Mark kept searching behind the scenes, with Linda's assistance, he gathered documentation of Roger's past with other animals, such as pictures and veterinarian. The data from situations when canines were taken from his custody revealed a somber image of a guy who appeared more concerned with owning dogs than with taking care of them. The attorney formally objected to Roger's assertion referencing the neglect data, together with a behavioral expert's declaration based on Buddy's observations at the shelter, and observed that he didn't seem to recognize Roger. "This dog doesn't seem to have a link with." The expert, Mr. Roger, stated that his actions indicate he has not been in Mr. Roger's care for a long time, if at all. But as the case developed, Mark saw a change. Buddy's normally gregarious demeanor became more reserved, as though he could sense the tension in the air. One evening while Mark was working on paperwork at the shelter, they were close to Mark and frequently curled up at his feet. Mark looked down to see the concern in the dog's eyes as his friend poured a gentle glass of wine and laid his paw on his lap. Mark scratched behind Buddy's ears and added, "Okay, boy, I won't let anything happen to you during the legal battle." Unexpectedly, when Ally appeared, a woman named Carol contacted the shelter and said she had previously been Roger's. "I used to live next door to Roger," Carol, a neighbor who felt prompted to speak up after seeing the news program, explained. "He mistreated his dogs during the phone call. Regardless of the weather, they were constantly chained outside. And he," Carol, who hardly fed them, consented to give a sworn statement, giving their case even more legitimacy. Mark was given new hope by the testimony and the other evidence, which the shelter personnel plunged themselves into. Their efforts by planning adoption events and utilizing the increased awareness to promote other animals in need, fundraising events and instructive seminars, all the while monitoring the impending court date. Buddy became a representation of perseverance his tale motivating others to act. Volunteers adorned the shelter with placards that proclaimed Buddy's. As Buddy's court date drew near, Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the battle being every dog's battle and justice for Buddy. Of the burden he was carrying, this wasn't merely about winning a case. It was about demonstrating that every dog. Mark sat with Buddy in the silent shelter the night before the hearing because he deserved a second shot and a loving home. Mark whispered, "No matter what happens tomorrow, you will always be a part of my life," as he stroked the dog's fur. "We won't disappoint you, Buddy." He glanced up at him, his tail bobbing a little as though he understood. When the court hearing day finally arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Mark was wearing his finest suit, but his nerves were raw. The dog gazed up at him with trusting eyes as he fastened Buddy's leash to his collar, his resolve strong. "Boy," Mark asked, "you ready?" in a voice that was a little shaky, but he wagged his tail. Despite the impending showdown of the courts, his calm manner, and the tense mood among supporters of the Mark felt a surge as shelter people gathered outside with posters that read "Justice for Buddy" and "Protect the Innocent." In appreciation for the community's support, he nodded to Anna, who was surrounded by a group of. There was a noticeable sense of anxiety inside the courtroom as volunteers wore similar shirts with Buddy's photo on them. Roger, with his attorney at his side, sat at the plaintiff's table and scowled at Mark. With a mixture of smugness and rage, Mark inhaled deeply and composed himself, concentrating on the case they had. The judge, who had been painstakingly prepared, entered the room followed by a stern-looking woman with keen eyes that looked about. Roger's attorney started by claiming that Roger's friend had been his property and that she had brought the proceedings to order. Because Mark had no authority to step in, he depicted a kind owner who had momentarily lost his dog. Due to regrettable circumstances, Mark's attorney presented the evidence they had collected, which included pictures of Buddy's malnourished state, Carol's sworn declaration, and the behavioral expert's testimony were all presented for the. Every piece of evidence refuted Roger's assertions in court, and when Mark's turn to speak came, he gave his all. He started by hammering Your Honor, saying, "My friend is more than simply a dog. He's a real being who deserves kindness and consideration. When our friend came to us, he was afraid, malnourished, and in dire need of assistance. We've given him another opportunity at life, and I think that sending him back to Mr. Roger would destroy all of his accomplishments." Mark looked at his friend, who was sitting quietly next to him, and felt a surge of resolve come over him. He went on to say that this is about more than simply Buddy. It's about establishing a standard, that animals are friends, relatives, and companions, not just trash. The judge's face softened a little as Mark talked, but she maintained her composure when Roger was summoned to. During cross-examination, his demeanor was unpredictable and defensive. Contradicted himself several times, finding it difficult to explain why his friend had been discovered in such bad shape. The crucial. When Carol was finally asked to testify, her testimony was unambiguous and damning. "I've seen how Roger handles his. Dogs are frequently left outside without food or water," she stated forcefully. To him, he was simply another abandoned animal. Roger's attorney tried to undermine her, but Carol's composure and she was a convincing witness due to her constant responses, and the last piece of proof was a video that showed one of the volunteers at the shelter had recorded Buddy's change while he was there, and the footage revealed friends showing up at the shelter looking thin and afraid, followed by footage of him flourishing in their custody in courtroom. Was quiet while the film was playing, and everyone could see how emotionally charged Buddy's journey was when it was over. When the court called for a quick break to go over the evidence, Mark sat down with shaky hands, and Anna leaned close over and mumbled, "You did fantastic. You stood up for Buddy no matter what." Mark looked at Roger, who was stooped down, his face flushed with annoyance, as they waited for the judge to return. Nonetheless, laid his head on Mark's knee and exuded serenity when the judge returned to the courtroom, everyone stood there in a state of nervous quiet. She took a seat and started talking in a measured tone. After examining the evidence and listening to both sides' testimonies, it is evident that Buddy's Mr. Roger has not been acting in his best interests. The shelter's evidence shows a pattern of. As the judge went on, Mark held his breath, saying, I thus grant complete custody of Buddy too. Relief flooded through the shelter on the condition that he stays under their care or is adopted into a good home. As the judge's ruling dawned on Anna, she placed her hand over her mouth and let the tears fall. When the news reached the supporters outside, they cheered. Roger pounded his fists on the table and mumbled angrily. As the courtroom began to empty, Mark knelt down and gave his friend a tight hug, whispering, We did it, boy. Later, when they left the courthouse, the audience outside exploded as they licked Mark's face and wiggled his tail wildly. Mark smiled and gripped Buddy's leash as people flocked to pet the dog, which had come to represent. Speaking to the crowd, Mark stated that the Buddy story's message of hope and perseverance doesn't end here. This is only the beginning. Let's continue to fight that night at the shelter for every animal who deserves a second chance. Was lively as volunteers for the celebration gathered in the main area, where balloons and a welcome home friend were displayed. Mark was still standing on the wave of relief and happiness as the banner hung from the ceiling. You're a hero, Buddy, sitting boldly at his side in the middle of the crowd. Mark replied, ruffling the dog's ears, and his friend joyfully wagged his tail as though. I only want to emphasize that he recognized the significance of the moment when Anna clinked a glass to get everyone's attention. Her voice trailed off as she said, This victory is not just for my friend, but for every animal we fought. You've demonstrated to us what it means to stand up for what's right, no matter how difficult it becomes, by protecting Mark. Mark's face flushed with thanks as he remarked, I couldn't have done it without all of you. To applause. Despite the lump in his throat, Buddy's story demonstrates how kindness and tenacity can transform lives. As the festivities went on, Mark observed his friend scuttling through the crowd with his tail wagging while people gave him belly rubs and treats. The change from the frightened stray who initially entered Mark's life to the self-assured and adored canine he had developed into something truly extraordinary as the celebration came to an end. Anna smiled softly and walked up to Mark. Have you considered what's next for Buddy? She said. Mark paused. I think he's already found his home, he replied in a calm but forceful voice, referring to the dog cuddled up by the hearth. Anna's smile grew as she joined me. I suspected you would say the following. Mark felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't had in years as he prepared Buddy's adoption paperwork. His friend was lying at his feet, munching on a noisy toy as he signed his name on the last line. It appears that you are now officially my partner, as Anna had given him as a victory gift. Mark replied, scratching Buddy's. The dog's head looked up, and his tail pounded on the ground when he heard the news. Buddy's story gained widespread attention, and donations to the shelter kept coming in from all throughout the neighborhood, allowing the team to increase their work and save even more animals in need. Motivated by, a number of families came to the shelter to adopt additional dogs, giving them the second opportunity they so richly deserve. But a journalist who had reported on the court case offered the Buddy tale to a reporter, so it wasn't only a local phenomena. National news station, and before long, Buddy's story of justice and tenacity was garnering national attention. Supporting words were posted on the shelter's social media pages, and people from all around the world shared their own. One comment, in particular, "Thank you for fighting for Buddy," stuck out among the tales of saving animals in need. Mark explained to me why I got my dog Max, who is also a stray dog. Keep up the good work, it's having an impact. Message with Anna, who smiled proudly when she mentioned that Buddy isn't simply changing, is inspiring people all throughout the world. In the weeks that followed, his friend adapted to life as Mark's official companion. He cuddled up next to Mark when working late shifts at the shelter and accompanied him on errands. Even when he welcomed guests with a pleasant bark and a wagging tail, his presence brought solace and happiness too. When Mark and Buddy were strolling around the park one evening, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold. Mark thought back on their experience with the stress and uncertainty of the court battle. Having given Buddy the life he deserved had been worth it. As they sat on a bench with a view of the pond, Buddy laid his. Mark stroked the dog's head while it rested on his lap, his eyes half closed in satisfaction. "You know that, Buddy," Mark said quietly. "You've made my heart swell with gratitude. Taught me a lot about love, resiliency, and standing up for what's right. I thought I was saving you, but perhaps you saved me too." Buddy's tail was wagging languidly, indicating that he agreed with what Mark had said at the shelter. As victory continued to spur change, the group started Buddy's Legacy, a new project that aims to promote. The initiative turned into a beacon of hope by enforcing stronger animal welfare rules and offering assistance to pet owners in need. Months later, at a town event, Mark was asked to talk on Buddy's influence on the community. Buddy's narrative. Mark stood on stage with Buddy beside him and said, "This dog," pointing to the audience, "Buddy is more than simply a pet. He represents what occurs when we decide to act with kindness instead of callousness. Apathy. It is our responsibility to give animals the chance they deserve." Mark felt a surge of pride as he gazed down at his friend, who was waving his tail as though to soak up the applause from the crowd. The stars were shining brightly above Mark when he and Buddy arrived home that evening, and Mark knew that. Together, they would continue to battle for those unable to fight for themselves, spreading the word that their journey was not ended. A message of optimism, kindness, and fortitude as Buddy's tale gained popularity in the media. When the community's uproar against Mark's old employer's inhumane policies reached a breaking point, people came together, carrying posters outside the fast food chain's offices that say "Compassion over Justice" and "Judy's for Buddy." Profitable local animal rights groups joined the campaign, raising the voices of those calling for accountability. Mario was drawn into the fray as a reluctant participant after initially being overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. Spokesman Anna urged him to utilize the opportunity to push for long-lasting change, saying, "This is bigger than Buddy now." Stated that you have an opportunity to guarantee that no one else experiences the same injustice. One afternoon, Mark got an unexpected. A senior executive from the fast food company was on the other end of the call. Her voice was businesslike but tense. "Mr. Reynolds, we'd like to speak with you privately about this," she added, referring to Mark's hold on the. "After everything you've done to Buddy and me." The phone became tense and private, but now you want to ignore it. The executive was hesitant, "But we are prepared to provide damages compensation because we think this situation can be settled quietly." But the prospect of financial respite made Mark's heart race. After losing his work, he was still having financial difficulties, but the demonstrators' faces outside his mind rushed to headquarters. This wasn't just about him. There was a systemic problem that needed to be. Mark firmly stated, "I'm not interested in a reward. What I want is a dedication to altering your rules, beginning with the way you handle your staff and the animals in your care. I'll present this to our board of directors, Mr. Reynolds, on the executive side, but I." Mark hung up, saying, "Can't promise anything you do." His resolve only got stronger, more resilient. This battle was far from done. Later that day, Mark went to a community gathering at the shelter where supporters gathered. A young woman sobbed as she told others in the group about their personal encounters with unfair treatment and animal abuse. Spoke about how she was fired for saving a stray kitten from a hazardous parking lot, and her remarks struck a deep chord. We must continue to put pressure on Mark, who informed the group that we must support his resolve to see the initiative through. It's about standing up for what's right, not just about one dog or one person. Later that day, Mark went to a community. When supporters gathered at the shelter, they filled the room with tales of their personal encounters with discrimination and animal abuse. A young woman, in tears, described how she was dismissed for saving a stray kitten from a risky situation. Her remarks struck a deep chord with Mark in the parking lot, strengthening his resolve to. We must continue to exert pressure on Mark, who informed the group that this isn't just about one dog or one. Later that day, Mark went to a community meeting at the shelter, where he learned the importance of sticking up for what's right. Supporters flooded the room with tales of their personal encounters with cruelty to animals and unfair treatment. A young lady sobbed as she described how she was fired for saving a stray kitten from a hazardous parking lot. Remarks struck a deep chord with Mark, strengthening his resolve to see the revolution through. We must continue to apply pressure. Mark explained to the gathering that this is about standing up for what's right in the meantime, not about one dog or one person. In preparation for his own meeting, Mark received a call from a lawyer for the fast food business. Talk about possible reforms. The email invitation had ambiguous claims, but no assurances, and Anna was seated across from. The email was read by Mark at their kitchen table, and they requested that you cease your public activism in return for a financial settlement. Anna stated in a skeptical tone that they aren't providing any tangible policy changes. Mark's jaw tightened. He and the other employees and animals who have been there deserve better. Anna nodded. But they're simply trying to silence me. Let's make sure they hear us more loudly the next time. To his astonishment, Mark's friend was trotting faithfully at his side when he arrived at the law office in the morning for the meeting. A number of senior executives, including the CEO, had concluded that the company's legal representation wasn't by themselves. When the two sides sat across from one another, the atmosphere in the room was tense. The CEO, Mr. Reynolds' silence was broken by a middle-aged guy wearing a deliberately neutral expression. We're here to put things right after reviewing your case and admitting that mistakes were made. Mark leaned forward. If you believe that this is only about me, you're missing the calm, yet determined tone in his speech. Argument that what transpired with Buddy and me is a component of a larger issue that humans and animals should be treated with. The CEO nodded slowly, and we realized that respect is not a transitory annoyance. Now, which is why we're thinking of changing our policies. Mark squinted, thinking it wasn't good enough. Wished to see a formal commitment to change one that incorporates employee safeguards and practices for humane treatment. The two parties argued about the details regarding our animals, but Mark remained firm. He made thorough recommendations for policy changes, refusing to be influenced by empty pledges or cash rewards. Using feedback from the community and specialists in animal welfare, his zeal and perseverance won over the executives. At the conclusion of the meeting, the CEO held out his hand to Mr. Reynolds, who we are, willing to present your suggestions for a vote to the board. But we would appreciate it if you will publicly recognize our. Mark paused in his attempts to make amends, looking down at his friend as he considered the. Finally, he shook the CEO's hand and said, I'll support this, citing the innumerable people and animals who would benefit from these reforms. If the improvements are genuine, a mob of supporters outside the office will show that words alone are insufficient. And reporters eagerly awaited Mark's news. As he left with Buddy at his side, the audience's applause filled. Mark raised as the air cameras flashed, and reporters barraged him with inquiries. To calm everyone down, we made a significant advancement today, and the business is committed to reviewing and implementing laws that put compassion and justice first. But this isn't the end. It's just the start. We'll hold them responsible at every turn. The audience cheered, and Mark felt a wave of hope that this was about everyone who believed in doing what was right, not just about his battle. On the day of the board meeting, the fast food company would make a decision over whether to adopt the drastic adjustments Mark had requested or retreat into damage control. The result would not only signify the future, but the lives of innumerable employees and animals affected by the company's regulations on the day of the board were. When the meeting came, the fast food business would have to choose whether to implement the extensive modifications Mark had proposed, required, or retreat into damage control. The result would impact not just Mark's future, but also the lives of innumerable people, employees, and animals affected by the company's boardroom policies. The directors, who represented a wide spectrum of interests and viewpoints, engaged in heated argument in a stressful environment. While some contended that following Mark's recommendations was the morally and tactically correct course of action, others expressed concern regarding the expense and possible criticism from shareholders. The CEO, who had been influenced by Marx's fervor during their Rose spoke earlier. We are at a crossroads and can decide whether to hold on to outmoded methods and run the danger of losing our clients' trust. Or we can set an example and demonstrate to the world that we value more than financial gain. His words lingered in the air till there was tension in the boardroom as the chairwoman called for a vote. Directors, and representing a variety of viewpoints and interests, engaged in heated argument. Some contended that putting Mark's suggestions were the best course of action for others, both tactically and morally. Concerned about the expense and possible criticism from shareholders, the CEO had been influenced by Mark's enthusiasm during. Rose spoke at their previous meeting. We are at a crossroads and have the option to stick with risky and antiquated methods, losing our clients' faith, or we can set an example and demonstrate to the world that we are more than. Mark stepped onto a makeshift stage as the chairman eventually called for a vote after his remarks lingered in the air. That was positioned outdoors. The audience became still as he lifted the microphone. I have amazing news, he said, starting his. Despite his whirlwind of emotions, he spoke steadily, and the board decided to adopt the reform we've been fighting for. This business has pledged to implement measures that safeguard its employees, treat animals with respect, and honor its clients. The audience cheered with compassion as they waved, clapped, and hugged, as if joining in on Mark's excitement. Their signs triumphantly companion-barked. Please raise your hand to calm the throng. This victory is ours, not just mine. Evidence that we can effect genuine change when we get together. Let this be a reminder that as the festivities went on, Mark experienced a deep sense of accomplishment because the battle had been drawn out and tiresome, but every second spent gazing down at a friend who was excitedly waving his tail made Mark happy. This little dog started a movement that demonstrated to the world how kindness might transform lives. The atmosphere outside the firm offices was electrifying, but Mark's real test of transformation was yet to come. The triumph wasn't merely regarding policy changes. It was about making sure that the commitments made that day were followed through on a week later. The CEO of the company unexpectedly invited Mark to join a newly established advisory group. The panel's mission would be to supervise the change's implementation and provide accountability at all levels. It was a chance that Mark couldn't pass up, despite the fact that it required him to venture well beyond his comfort zone. As he entered the sleek conference room for the panel's first meeting, his friend trotted after him, clicking his paws. The other panelists, who were executives, experts in animal welfare, and workers' rights, leaned gently against the gleaming floorboards. Advocates had already taken their seats, their faces displaying a mixture of interest and doubt. Mark sat down at the table. The months that followed were a blur of activity as Mark and the panel examined his steely determination. Let's get started. They discovered every aspect of the business's operations, including employee training initiatives and sourcing procedures. Challenging problems, but also discovered chances for significant progress. One of the panel's initial successes was the creation of a fund to assist workers in need of financial assistance, which is funded by voluntary pay reductions from top executives, turned into a lifeline for employees who were having financial difficulties. Mark additionally collaborated with the business to collaborate with nearby animal shelters to offer resources and spread the word about adopting a pet. Became the initiative's unofficial mascot, showing up in promotional materials, and even going with Mark to neighborhood gatherings. His narrative kept people motivated by reminding them of the power of small deeds of kindness, notwithstanding the advancements that have been made. Employees were dubious about the changes, thinking they were just a publicity gimmick. Mark understood that gaining their trust would require time and persistent work. Mark went to the fast food restaurant one afternoon. It felt strange to return to the place where he had previously worked, but this time as a visitor rather than in. Mark chatted to the personnel, sharing his experiences, and the new manager gave him a warm welcome and introduced him to the team. By the conclusion of the visit, he could see the doubt in their eyes start to lessen as they told him the tale and the improvements he had pushed for. One young worker hesitantly came up to him and said, "Thank you for what you've done." Her voice was soft, but sincerely. Knowing that someone is watching out for us means a lot." Mark grinned, feeling "Don't ever forget how vital you are as the reason I continue to fight," he said, giving me a renewed feeling of purpose. Customers who had boycotted the business started to change their opinions of the company as improvements gained hold, returned feeling inspired by the company's newfound responsibility and transparency. As media outlets noted, Mark's journey, which calls the company's transformation a model for moral corporate conduct, came to fruition. Circle, standing on the podium at a national convention on corporate responsibility after being asked to speak. He told his story of how helping a stray puppy started him on a path in front of hundreds of business leaders. Mark replied, his voice echoing throughout the auditorium, "Kindness isn't just a feeling he never could have imagined. It's a daily decision that serves as the cornerstone of trust and the catalyst for change. And if one stray dog can spark a movement, it's the link that binds us. Imagine what we can accomplish together." The audience stood up, and the hallmark stared out as the applause reverberated, with a deep sense of hope that the world wasn't flawless at the sea of faces. However, it was worthwhile the battle because Mark stood on stage and was greeted by loud applause that swept over him like a wave. He gave himself permission to pause and consider the scope of the entire journey, from a menial delivery driver fired for A. As he watched, a single act of kindness to a symbol of compassion sparked transformation. When he saw the audience, he understood that this was not only his tale, but also the narrative of everyone who had faith in the ability to. After the conference, Mark went back to his hometown and did the right thing, no matter the cost, where he discovered his friend, who had grown beyond simply being his company, waiting at the front entrance with his tail wagging wildly, was a representation of resiliency and hope. Each time Mark gazed upon him, he was reminded of the impact of an act of kindness could lead to the fast food chain's reforms continuing to take root and change the assessments of employee satisfaction with the business culture revealed significant improvements, and community outreach initiatives flourished as employees felt free to express their concerns without worrying about reprisals. Buddy's visage grew more well-known as local shelters reported more adoptions as a result of the company's marketing. Mark's life was transformed by a well-known emblem in these endeavors that symbolizes second chances for both people and animals. Additionally, the relationships he had formed while advocating for causes created openings for him, and he started working together. He visited schools and community centers with groups that support workers' rights and animal welfare, sharing his narrative and inspiring others to defend their convictions in spite of his expanding platform. Mark stayed confined. He kept volunteering at the neighborhood animal shelter and spending time with dogs that reminded him of. When questioned about Buddy's optimism, resilience, and desire to find a home, despite his hectic schedule, Mark found time to volunteer. His response was straightforward. It's where it all began. Mark and Buddy's story went viral on social media, reaching far beyond their small community, overflowing with messages from those motivated by their journey, many of whom share their own deeds of kindness using hashtags such as "Kindness Counts" and the "Bis Buddy Effect" trended, igniting discussing how seemingly insignificant actions could result in significant transformation. Mark got innumerable letters and calls from people whose narrative had impacted people's lives, but one letter from a former fast food chain employee caught the author's attention. Expressed gratitude to Mark for providing a voice to employees like her, and explained how the company's modifications had enabled her to aspiration to become a nurse. "Your generosity saved more than just a dog," the letter said. As the seasons changed and Mark thought back on the lessons he had learned, he came to the realization that being kind wasn't about showing off or receiving praise. It was about being there for people even when it was difficult or it was unpleasant, because it focused on recognizing people's humanity and their potential in situations that others would overlook. Buddy stayed by his side through it all, a bit slower and a little older, and their relationship was proof of the strength of devotion and love. And Mark was thankful every day for the chance encounter that had brought them together one clear. A young child approached Mark and Buddy as they were strolling around the park one autumn evening. "Is that Buddy?" the boy questioned. Mark nodded and grinned as the youngster, whose eyes were bright with delight, knelt down to pet the famous dog and murmured, "My mom," shared his tale with me, saying that he's the reason I acquired my puppy Mark. His heart melted, but he's a unique dog, remarked, petting the dog's head. "But remember that anyone may be good, even you." The youngster smiled, and as after his mother left, Mark felt incredibly fulfilled since he had not only transformed his own life, but he had also begun a. That evening, as Mark and Buddy sat on his porch, he looked up at the wave that was still expanding. Brilliance. He reflected on the unforeseen trajectories of his life and the individuals who had supported him during the. Most importantly, he considered the impact of a single instance in which he put compassion ahead of convenience, and how that decision had changed everything. "Not bad for a stray dog," Mark said in an emotionally charged tone, as though to convey that we did it together. And in the silence of that evening, he waggled his tail while resting his head on Mark's lap. Mark was aware that although his narrative with his friend had begun with a small deed of kindness, it would never really come to an end, would endure in every act of kindness motivated by their journey, demonstrating that even the tiniest actions might have a profound impact. The world, if this tale reminded you that even the little deed of compassion can have a profound impact, whether your actions have the power, whether you're rescuing a stray animal, defending someone, or just spreading love. Remember to subscribe to our channel to see more touching tales like these and to help bring about change. Make sure to watch our upcoming video.